I took a 2-year break from podcasting because I was completely burnt out. Here's what happened and how you can avoid the same thing. Are you ready? Let's go. What's up, everybody, and welcome back, I guess, to the Self-Made Web Designer podcast. It has been a while. If you're a new listener, you're probably thinking, what are you talking about? I've just been catching up on all the episodes, and if that's you, I'm glad you're here, but there's a little more to the story. Back in the spring of 2022, I announced to the podcast that I was going to be taking a break to work on a special project and would be back sometime in the fall of 2022. But then fall of 2022 came around and I was not ready to start it back up again. And then the spring of 2023 came around and I was not ready to get started back up again. And then 2024 came around. So you kind of see the pattern. Like I just kept pushing it off and pushing it off. And so I realized in the midst of all that I was actually dealing with some pretty heavy burnout. So let's backtrack a little bit and talk about what the project was that I was working on and kind of how it all unfolded, that I realized I needed to stop absolutely all of the non-essential stuff in my life and just focus on my family and get better as a person. So my friend, who I'd known and done work with in ministry for years and years and years, decided to actually leave their ministry job. And so in the course of her figuring out what her next steps were going to be, we had a conversation. She had done some design work with my wife at the church that we were at. And so I was like, hey, why don't I just teach you how to use Showit? We'll start an agency. I'll get some work and then I'll just contract you to help me build these websites. So I didn't need the websites. I just knew that my friend needed some work and I knew that I was really good at just finding clients. And so if I could do the finding clients part, she could do the work part, and it could be like a really great working relationship. And it went well for a really long time. We were getting clients consistently. But then my friend who I had helped, who was building this agency with me, got hired at Showit, which is awesome. But the question became, do I still want to be doing this? And the answer for me was when I was sitting in my house all alone, frantically working, trying to get a website finished. But my family was off having a good time with some friends at a park and then just enjoying themselves. And I asked myself, what happened here? Why am I here? I don't need to be doing this, and yet I feel like I need to be doing this. There's this great book about burnout that I encourage you to read called Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle by Emily and Amelia Nagosaki. They talk about how there's two parts to stress. There's the experience stress, which is where something stressful is happening, and that experience stress can be solved once the problem is solved. Like, for instance, my friend needed a job. We had the stress of like, let's help my friend make some money, learn a new skill. And then that problem got solved when she got hired at Showit. We didn't have to keep working our tails off trying to find clients and doing projects. But the other side of stress is the impression that it leaves on your mind and your heart, where there's no longer a sense of danger. There's no longer anything that's going to happen to you that's bad, but you still kind of feel like it is. It reminds me of an episode I watched where Chris Hemsworth is doing like this study on longevity, and he's doing all these crazy things like going swimming in the Antarctic and balancing on beams on a skyscraper kind of stuff. And they're looking at all this stuff. He talked about how as an actor, there were just a lot of years where he was barely making it. He's couch surfing. He was just taking absolutely everything that he could because he didn't know when his next job was going to be. He just needed to make money so he could have food to eat. But then when he got his big role as Thor, even though he no longer needed to hustle and work and feel the stress of life, he still felt like he had to keep pushing and keep looking and keep working because he never knew when it was all going to be pulled away. And that's how I felt. So I knew I needed to take some time off. So me and my wife made a pact and said, we're not going to take on any extra projects, any extra work for a good amount of time as we're kind of healing and processing through the things that we've dealt with. And so that's what I did. And honestly, a lot of it was guilt because I knew that I had told you guys, just give me a few months and I'll be back. And then all of a sudden months turned into years. And so I've been holding off because I felt so bad. But having gone through the process and realized that I think a lot of people are probably experiencing the same thing that I am, I decided to go ahead and give it another shot and talk about my experience and talk about the things that I've learned and what I've done to kind of avoid the next go around. In that same book, Emily and Amelia and Nagosaki talk about how we all have this inner expectation machine in the stuff that we're doing, where we're like, I'm going to try this thing out and I expect to make this progress along the way. But what happens when our expectations aren't met with the reality of the progress, or we feel like we should be further along or it shouldn't be as difficult, that slowly begins to start the burnout process. There's this machine that is constantly evaluating, like, okay, I'm going to do this thing and it's going to get me to this place and we're going to be doing this much and it's going to have this much stuff along with it. But if over the course of time that doesn't end up being true, you end up starting to get more and more disappointed, and that disappointment lends itself to feeling like hopeless and not being able to even do simple things like turn your camera on just to get the video started again. So what are the things that I found were helpful? Number one, I had to change my expectations. I had to realize that my expectations were almost like laughably impossible. Like, I wanted to see the type of progress that maybe like 1% of the people who have a podcast or have a YouTube channel or have a business actually experience. And so I had to go back and say, okay, these aren't reasonable expectations. And what I found was that when you have unreasonable expectations, even the progress that you do make doesn't feel great. Let's say you have an expectation to make $150,000 on your first year of freelancing as a web designer. That would be pretty fantastic. Like, not a lot of people have done that. But let's say you do half of that. Let's say you do $75,000 in your first year of freelancing as a web designer. That's pretty awesome. That's actually a really good income for your first year at trying something out. And so even though you did a really good job and you made $75,000 on that first year, you feel like you failed because you didn't hit $150,000 in that first year. So you've got to be careful to really make sure your expectations align with reality. And I know there's this line that says, shoot for the moon, even if you miss, you'll land among the stars. But honestly, if you shoot for the moon and miss, you're just going to be disappointed, and that disappointment is going to make it hard to keep going. So be careful with your expectations. I'm not saying not to have big goals, but you can either have big goals and allow yourself more time to accomplish that, or you can chop up those goals into more manageable bite-sized goals that you know you're going to be able to accomplish along the way. And even if you say, like, I'm going to give myself goals that I have a 51% chance of actually accomplishing, that would be better than shooting for goals that I've got a 10% chance of accomplishing, right? Like, yeah, it sounds awesome. And when it happens, it's inspiring, but it doesn't happen very often. You've got to give yourself some grace on the expectations that you have for yourself. Another thing that I realized is that I was buying into what I now call the finish line fallacy. The finish line fallacy is this idea that there's going to be some point in time when you've done enough things, you've done enough work, that you've reached a level where you can say, okay, I'm done. This is it. I've made it. I've finished. The problem is that with most of life, that's just not true. Like, there is no finish line. There is no finish line to living a good life, right? There's no point where you can go, oh, I've made it. There is no finish line to building a good business. There is no finish line to growing as a person. And so if you've got this finish line in mind and you're just constantly pushing towards that, then you're going to be disappointed, and that machine is going to get out of whack where your expectations don't meet reality and you find yourself burnt out. So what do? Instead of thinking about the finish line, you learn to find joy in the everyday things that you're doing. There's this really great quote from Nick Offerman, who plays Ron in Parks and Rec. And he talked about how he was coming up with a whole bunch of actors who were much more talented than he is. But over time, more and more actors started kind of falling off and pursuing other things that made more money. And so he realized that if he was going to make it, he had to learn to be completely satisfied right where he was. And so he talks about how he kind of tricked himself into happiness so that when he got his life-changing role on Parks and Rec, he was actually just completely content with where he was at. And I think the same has to be true of anyone trying to build anything. If you're trying to start a web design side hustle, if you're trying to build a web design side hustle agency, you've got to learn just to be satisfied with where you are, even if it's not where you would want to be. You've got to learn to appreciate the small wins, even if they're not astronomical wins. So learning to love the mundane. And part of it for me was I actually realized that I just had a love of writing. I just love to write. And so I started this practice of trying to write 1,000 words 5 days a week. And as I was doing it, eventually I was like, you know what? I could just start writing for Self-Made Web Designer again. Like I could just do that. I could just start sending out email newsletters. I could just write some blogs, because this is the thing that I really love to do. I find joy and fulfillment just having known that I've sat down on my computer and I've come up with 1,000 words to share ideas. And so learning how to take those small wins and then allow yourself to build them up over time can keep you from having that burnout. So I was writing 1,000 words. It was beginning to get really easy. Then I said, well, why don't I just take these 1,000 words and I can talk about them in front of a camera, and then I can share them in front of a microphone. And then lo and behold, we have the Self-Made Web Designer podcast that is back online. And then the final thing that I had to do is fight against cynicism. And I know it probably doesn't come across this way on camera, but I actually am a pretty cynical person. I actually see things not on the light side, but on the dark side, even though, Darth Vader is not really a big deal in my house. We'll watch Star Wars, but not true Star Wars fans. I'm sorry if I lose you as a subscriber because of that fact. But I tend to have a hard time seeing the positives and a really easy time seeing the negatives. And that's helped me to do things like grow a business, because I'm able to navigate away from some really bad scenarios. But at the same time, it's made it really hard when I get discouraged. And so that is something that I consistently have to train myself to think about the things that have happened that are really awesome, to think about the smaller milestones that other people would love to have in their lives, and they've been trying to accomplish for years and years, that I myself have been able to personally see, and to take it in for what it's worth and truly celebrate it. Fight against that cynicism. Allow myself a moment to say, yeah, this has been a big thing. Like, I've done a big thing. It's okay to celebrate. It's okay to not feel like I've got to worry about the next paycheck or worry about growing or not feeling like I'm contributing enough. Ali Abdaal talks about how when he went from a part-time to a full-time YouTuber, he actually hated it. This was his dream. He was a doctor. He was doing YouTube on his free time, but then his YouTube channel started making more money than his doctor's salary. And so he realized that what he was once doing just for fun was now an obligation that he didn't like keeping. So to pull himself out of it, he just kept reading himself affirmations he'd written before every single recording. And that's something that can be really helpful, just to remind yourself, like, this is why I'm doing this thing. It's because A, B, C, D. I know some people who they keep folders of good feedback that they've gotten from clients or from bosses or employers, and they just kind of look at that stuff anytime that they're feeling down. And that would be my encouragement to you. And so you might find yourself in a similar scenario where you've been working really hard and things have been going okay, but they haven't been going to the expectations that you would have liked them to be at. And so here's my encouragement to you. It's okay to take a break. It's okay to pause. Obviously, that's what I did. But just know it's never bad to start over, even if it took you longer than you expected it to take. You might have started your freelance web design business a few years ago and things didn't go how you thought they would. It's okay to start again. It's okay to decide to try and do something else. The point is, just don't give up. I say it in every single episode. If you don't quit, you win. And this is me not quitting, and this is me encouraging you to not quit. either. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope it gave you some perspective, hopefully on your own life, as you might be facing challenging scenarios. And we will have more episodes on the Self-Made Web Designer podcast. I can't tell you when. I'm hoping that they're going to be weekly, but you just never know. I kind of have to go with the flow at this point. But until next time, check out my blog where the show notes are going to be. The free Web Designer Starter Kit course is available for you still at my website, selfmadewebdesigner.com. There will be links in the show notes. So my encouragement for you, friend, just go for it and keep pushing and be okay with slow progress, because slow progress is still progress. We'll see you next time.